At 2:47 p.m. on a Saturday in June, my sister stood up in front of 63 people and asked my 9-year-old son why he couldn't just act normal for one afternoon. I know it was 63 people because I counted the RSVPs myself, the way I count everything. That's the job. I draft trusts for a living. I read people's last wishes for a living. And that day, I learned exactly what my family thought my son was worth. This is not a story about a tantrum at a party. Welcome back to Calm Revenge Tales, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe, because this one has a letter in it that I still keep folded in my desk drawer. I am a trust and estate attorney. 22 years old when I passed the bar, 38 now, and somewhere in those 16 years I stopped being able to hear a promise without wondering how it would hold up in probate court. It is not a romantic way to move through the world. My husband, Daniel, used to tease me about it on our first dates. He'd say something like, "I'll love you forever," and I'd ask him if he wanted that in writing. He did, eventually. We wrote our own vows. His were funny. Mine had a clause about mutual respect that our officiant read aloud like it was a joke, and it wasn't. Not really. We have one son, Milo. He was diagnosed with autism at 4, after 2 years of us knowing something was different and not having a name for it yet. Milo does not do noise well. He does not do crowds well. He does a very particular kind of joy well, the kind where he flaps his hands so hard his whole body lifts onto his toes. The kind where he narrates dinosaur facts in a voice that carries across a room whether the room wants it to or not. My family has always found this embarrassing. I have always found it to be the best sound in my house. My mother's family runs on an old and unspoken ledger. My sister Renata is the golden entry, the one who married well, who redid her kitchen twice, who posts captioned photographs of herself being generous. I am the other kind of entry. The one who shows up. I drove my mother to 11 chemo appointments the year she was sick. I paid off my father's business loan 2 years before he died so the bank wouldn't take the house out from under my parents while he was in hospice. Nobody asked me to keep records of any of this. I kept them anyway. It is, I have come to understand, an occupational hazard and a form of self-defense at the same time. My father, Edmund, was the one person in that family who never made Milo feel like a problem to be managed. He used to sit on the floor with him and sort dinosaurs by era, patient in a way I didn't know he had in him until I watched him do it. He died 18 months ago. Congestive heart failure, quiet, in his sleep, the kind of death people call peaceful because it spares everyone the harder conversation about what a life was actually worth to the people who lived alongside it. I had drafted his will myself at his insistence, though a colleague handled the formal execution so there'd be no conflict of interest. I thought I knew everything that document said. I was wrong about one line, and that line is the reason you're watching this. The party was for Milo's graduation from 3rd grade, a small milestone, but a real one, because the year before had nearly broken him and us both. My mother wanted to host it at her house. Renata offered to bring the cake. 63 people came, some of them relatives I hadn't seen since my father's funeral, all of them there, ostensibly, to celebrate my son. Milo had a rough hour. The backyard was loud, someone had brought a dog that barked at the wrong moments, and by 2:30 he was overwhelmed in the way he gets overwhelmed, rocking, humming loudly, covering his ears, asking to go inside in a voice that kept climbing. I was walking him toward the house when Renata intercepted us in front of the dessert table, in front of everyone, and said, loudly enough that conversations around us actually stopped, "Can you get him to knock it off? Some of us are trying to have a normal party." When I told her he needed a break, not a correction, she laughed, an actual laugh, short and sharp, and said, "God, everything's a diagnosis with you people now. He's fine. He's just being dramatic." Milo heard every word of that. I watched it land on him the way I've watched things land on grown adults in depositions, the specific stillness of someone absorbing a wound they don't yet have language for. He started to cry, not the tantrum kind, the humiliated kind, and Renata, in front of dozens of people who had gone quiet enough to hear a pin drop, rolled her eyes and said, "This is exactly why nobody wants to invite you guys to things." I did not raise my voice. I have found, in 22 years of practice, that the moment you raise your voice is the moment you lose the room. I picked up my son, told my mother we were leaving, and walked out with 63 people watching me go. Before I left, I did something that has become instinct after 2 decades of drafting documents that people later swear they never signed. I asked my cousin, who'd been filming the cake cutting for my mother, to keep his phone recording. He did. I have that footage. Every word of it. 2 days later, a caseworker from Child Protective Services called my husband at his office to schedule a welfare visit. Someone had reported concerns about a child being, in the report's words, left unsupervised in visible emotional distress and removed from a family event without explanation. I did not need to ask who made that call. I already had the timestamp. My cousin's video was timestamped at 2:47 p.m. The CPS report, once I obtained it through proper channels, listed the call as coming in at 3:52 p.m., 1 hour and 5 minutes after we'd walked out my mother's front door. I sat with that report at my kitchen table long after Daniel had gone to bed, and I read the timestamp 3 times, the way I read every document that's about to change something. 1 hour and 5 minutes. That's not a concerned relative. That's a decision. 12 days after the CPS visit, which closed, unfounded, within a week because a trained caseworker took one look at our home and one conversation with Milo's pediatrician to understand exactly what she was looking at. I got a call from my father's estate attorney, Marian Alvarez, asking me to come in. Not as counsel, as a beneficiary. I want to be honest about what I expected walking into that office. I expected the standard division we discussed as a family after the funeral. House sold, proceeds split 3 ways between my mother's care, Renata, and me. I had reviewed the will myself more than a year earlier, and I remembered every line of it, or thought I did. What I had forgotten, what I hadn't been meant to remember, because my father had asked Marian to hold it separately until a specific condition was met, was a secondary instrument. A supplemental special needs trust, funded quietly over 4 years through a life insurance policy I never knew existed, naming Milo as sole beneficiary. Marian slid the trust document across the desk and let me read it in silence, which I have always respected in an attorney, because some pages need to be read without anyone watching your face while you do it. The trust held $340,000. It had been funded incrementally, in amounts small enough not to trigger the kind of conversation my father clearly hadn't wanted to have while he was alive. There was a distribution schedule for Milo's therapies, his education, his future independence. And there was a conduct clause, the kind estate attorneys call a forfeiture provision, the kind I have drafted for other families a dozen times and never once expected to need for my own. Any beneficiary of my father's broader estate who was found, by clear and documented evidence, to have engaged in harassment, public humiliation, or conduct endangering the welfare of his grandson would forfeit their remaining share of the residual estate, the house proceeds, with that forfeited share redirected in full to Milo's trust. I read it 3 times. Marian let me. Then she handed me a second envelope, smaller, sealed, my name on the front in my father's handwriting. Inside was a letter, 4 sentences long, written the year Milo was diagnosed. My father was not a man who wrote things down easily. The letter said very little about feelings and a great deal about intent, which is exactly like him. The line I keep coming back to, the line I have since had engraved on a small brass plate that sits in my office, was this: I have watched what this family does to the people who show up, and I will not let it happen to the one who never learned to hide. I did not act on any of this immediately. I called Marian back twice to confirm the forfeiture clause's evidentiary standard. I requested the full CPS file through the proper release. I had my cousin send me the original, unedited video with its metadata intact. I built a folder the way I build every file that's going to matter in a room full of people who don't yet know what's coming. It took me 6 weeks. I did not rush it, and I did not mention any of it to my mother or my sister. They came to me first, as I knew they would. My mother, gently, mentioned that the house had a buyer and that it would be good to get things settled before summer. Renata was less gentle. She showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening, unannounced, and told me she'd already spoken to a contractor about the pool she was planning once things came through, and that it was family money and Dad would have wanted it split evenly regardless of drama. I let her talk. When she finished, I asked her one question. What time had she called CPS? She said she hadn't. I did not correct her. I simply said I had somewhere to be, and I called Marion the next morning and told her to send the letters. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare one afternoon for a 9-year-old suddenly find all the time in the world once money enters the room, you already know exactly where this goes. Stick with me. If you've ever watched someone who couldn't be bothered to show real kindness suddenly show up the moment they smelled an inheritance, you know exactly the shape of what's coming. This channel exists for the people who stayed quiet through all of it and kept the paperwork anyway. So if that's you, stay with me and hit subscribe before we get to the part with the folder. The family called a meeting. My mother framed it as getting everyone on the same page before the closing, to be held at her house, the same backyard, 3 weeks after Renata's visit. I said yes. I brought a folder, plain, unmarked, the kind I use for closings I already know the outcome of. I arrived to find the patio arranged like a small tribunal, chairs in a loose circle, my mother at the head, Renata beside her already holding a legal pad with numbers on it that weren't hers to write. My brother, Theo, sat off to the side, the way he always does, present but uncommitted, the family's permanent abstention. Renata opened before I'd even sat down. She had prepared something close to a toast, thanking everyone for handling the last year with grace, noting that Dad would have wanted unity, not division, and concluding, with a small satisfied smile, that she'd already spoken to a realtor about timeline expectations for our share. When she finished, my mother turned to me, expecting, I think, agreement or at minimum silence. I asked for the floor. They gave it to me because for 1/2 second, they thought I was about to concede. I opened the folder and did not raise my voice once. I started with the video, my cousin's phone propped on the patio table, playing at full volume, 2:47 p.m., the timestamp burned into the corner of the frame. Renata's voice carrying clearly across a backyard that had gone silent for the second time in 3 months. I let it play the whole 31 seconds. Nobody spoke. Then I placed the CPS report on the table, opened to the intake page, and read aloud only the call timestamp, 3:52 p.m. I did not editorialize. I simply set the video's timestamp beside the report's timestamp and let the 65 minutes between them sit on the table like the third person in the room. Renata's face went through the exact sequence I have watched 100 clients' faces go through when evidence lands somewhere true, soft confusion first, then something brighter and more defensive, climbing fast toward loud. She said I was twisting things. Then she said everyone overreacts about Milo. Then, when I didn't answer either of those, she said, louder now, that this was exactly the kind of manipulation she'd expect from someone who makes a living out of other people's paperwork. I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before I answered it, because I have learned that the quieter you get, the further your next sentence travels. I said, you're right. I do. And I read yours very carefully. I took out the trust document next and read the forfeiture clause aloud, once, without commentary, the way I'd read it to any client. Then I read my father's letter, only the one line, because it was the only line that needed to be heard by anyone but me. I will not let it happen to the one who never learned to hide. Theo, who had said nothing the entire meeting, put his head down at that line. It was the only honest thing anyone did that afternoon, and I acknowledged it with a small nod, though it changed nothing about what came next. Renata's voice rose to something close to shouting, that I'd been planning this, that I'd turned a family tragedy into a legal ambush, that our father would be ashamed of me. I did not match her volume. I told her, evenly, that our father had spent 4 years quietly funding a trust for his grandson specifically because he suspected this exact afternoon might happen someday, and that the ambush, if there was one, had been hers. Delivered in front of 63 people to a 9-year-old who had done nothing but cry too loudly at his own party. The backyard went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when everyone present has finally run out of a story to tell themselves. I closed the folder. I stood up. I said one last thing before I left, the same 4 words my father's letter had given me, the ones I'd been carrying for 6 weeks like a verdict I hadn't yet delivered. He never learned to hide. Then I picked up the folder and walked to my car, and this time, nobody watched me go, they watched the folder. The closing on my father's house proceeded 3 weeks later. Renata's third of the residual estate, just under $210,000, was reallocated in full to Milo's Special Needs Trust per the forfeiture clause and the evidentiary record Marion filed with the court. My mother's share was untouched. She had not been named in any conduct provision, and I never sought to include her, though our relationship has cooled into something more careful than it used to be. Renata contested the reallocation once, briefly, through an attorney who read the same footage I had and advised her, apparently, not to pursue it further. She has not spoken to me since. Theo reached out a month later, awkward and honest in a way he'd never managed at the meeting, and he and Milo now spend most Saturdays sorting dinosaurs on my living room floor, the same way my father used to. I have not forgiven him for his silence that day. I have simply decided that showing up late is still a kind of showing up, and Milo needed more people who stayed, not fewer. The unedited video still lives on an external drive in my office safe, beside the CPS file and my father's letter, which I had reframed and now keep on my desk rather than in a drawer. I don't look at it often. I don't need to. I know what it says. Milo's trust now funds a therapist he adores, a summer program built for kids who think in the same specific, wonderful language he does, and a college fund that will exist whether or not he ever needs the word diagnosis to explain himself to anyone again. I did not touch $1 of it for anything but him, and I never will, not because the law requires it, though it does, but because that was never the point. People keep calling this revenge in the comments of stories like this one, and I understand why. But I don't think that's the right word for it. I didn't take anything from my sister. I simply stopped paying a debt I never agreed to carry, the debt of staying quiet so a room could remain comfortable at my son's expense. My father understood that debt better than anyone in that family ever gave him credit for, and the last thing he did with his money was tell the truth about who had actually been showing up. In his honor, Daniel and I set up a small annual scholarship in Milo's school district, funded separately from the trust, for a family managing a new diagnosis with more love than resources, the kind of help my father would have offered quietly, without ever calling it a gift. The line I keep coming back to, the one on the little brass plate on my desk, isn't really about Milo, and it isn't really about Renata. It's about every person in every family who has ever been told to be smaller so someone else could be comfortable. Calm is not the same thing as weak. My family had confused the two my entire life, and it turned out my father was the only one keeping score the way I had, quietly, patiently, and in writing. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts and that boundaries are allowed even with blood, take that as your sign. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.